Margaret Whitfield adjusted her reading glasses as she carefully placed the ornate jewelry box on her kitchen table. The morning light streaming through her modest apartment windows caught the edges of what appeared to be diamonds, emeralds, and sapphires, nestled in velvet compartments. Her hands trembled slightly, not from age, but from the weight of what she was about to do. 30 years, she whispered to herself, running her fingers over a particularly elaborate necklace. 30 years of keeping this secret. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed from the hallway outside her door, followed by aggressive knocking. Margaret's heart raced. She knew exactly who it was, and why he was here. Her son Bradley had finally come for what he believed was rightfully his, a fortune in family jewelry that he assumed would solve all his financial problems. What Bradley didn't know was that every piece in that box would shatter his world in ways he never imagined. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. Margaret Whitfield had always been the type of woman who chose her words carefully. At 68, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that commanded respect from the grocery store clerks, her neighbors, and even the young doctors at her medical appointments. Her silver hair was always perfectly styled, her clothes modest but well-maintained, and her small apartment in downtown Cleveland was immaculately clean, despite showing signs of financial constraint. The apartment itself told a story of gradual decline. The furniture was quality but decades old. The appliances worked but were clearly past their prime. Bills were stacked neatly on her kitchen counter, some marked with red stamps indicating overdue status. Yet, despite these obvious signs of financial struggle, Margaret always seemed to possess an air of someone who had once known better times. Her son Bradley, however, had never been one to notice subtleties. At 35, he had inherited his father's broad shoulders and commanding presence, but none of his father's work ethic or integrity. Bradley worked sporadically in construction, spending more time complaining about his circumstances than improving them. His wife, Jessica, a sharp-tongued woman with expensive tastes and a growing impatience with their modest lifestyle, had been pressuring him for months about his mother's mysterious jewelry collection. "Your mother sits on a fortune while we can barely make rent," Jessica would remind him daily. "Those pieces belong to your grandmother, your great-grandmother. They're family heirlooms, Bradley. They should be ours." Bradley had seen glimpses of the jewelry throughout his childhood, his mother wearing an elegant necklace to church on Christmas, a pair of stunning earrings during his high school graduation, a bracelet that seemed to catch light like captured starfire during family photographs. Each piece appeared to be worth thousands, possibly tens of thousands of dollars. Yet his mother lived like someone barely scraping by. The contradiction had puzzled him for years, but Jessica's constant reminders had transformed that puzzle into resentment. Why should his mother hoard valuable jewelry while her own son struggled? Why should she live modestly while sitting on what appeared to be a small fortune? The breaking point came on a rainy Tuesday in October. Bradley had just received another rejection letter from a potential employer, and Jessica had discovered their credit card application had been denied. Their landlord had already called twice about late rent, and their car was making noises that they couldn't afford to investigate. "That's it," Jessica declared, slamming down her coffee cup hard enough to slosh liquid onto their cramped kitchen table. "I'm done living like this while your mother plays a poor widow with a jewelry box full of diamonds. You need to have a conversation with her, Bradley. A serious conversation." Bradley knew exactly what his wife meant. It wasn't really going to be a conversation. It was going to be a demand. He had tried the gentle approach before. Casual mentions during their monthly dinners about how, quote, tough things were getting. Subtle hints about unexpected expenses and mounting bills. Even direct questions about the jewelry and whether his mother had ever considered selling a piece or two to help with her own obvious financial struggles. Margaret had always deflected these conversations with remarkable skill. She would change the subject to his job search, ask about Jessica's health, or suddenly remember something urgent she needed to do in the kitchen. The jewelry remained in her possession, carefully stored in an ornate wooden box that she kept in her bedroom, and never discussed in any meaningful detail. But Bradley's patience had finally run out. Jessica's pressure, combined with their deteriorating financial situation and his growing sense of entitlement, had crystallized into a determination that frightened him with its intensity. He was going to get those pieces, one way or another. The plan he and Jessica devised was straightforward. He would visit his mother, explain their desperate situation, and demand, that she either sell some of the jewelry to help them or simply give them pieces outright. After all, he was her only child. When she died, the jewelry would come to him anyway. Why make them both suffer financially when a simple transfer of assets could solve everyone's problems? Be firm, Jessica had instructed him that morning as he prepared to leave. Don't let her guilt trip you or change the subject. Those pieces have been in the family for generations. Your father would have wanted you to have them, especially if you needed them. Quote, Bradley wasn't entirely sure about what his father would have wanted. Robert Whitfield had died when Bradley was only 12, leaving behind memories of a man who worked hard, treated people fairly, and never seemed to care much about material possessions. But Jessica's certainty was contagious, and Bradley found himself believing that yes, his father would have wanted him to claim his inheritance. The walk to his mother's apartment building gave Bradley time to rehearse his arguments. He thought about the overdue bills, the job rejections, the constant stress that was putting strain on his marriage. He thought about the unfairness of his mother's situation. Why should she live in such modest circumstances while hoarding valuable jewelry? Wouldn't everyone be better off if the pieces were sold and the money used practically? By the time he reached his mother's door, Bradley had convinced himself that he was actually doing her a favor. She was getting older, living alone, obviously struggling financially. The jewelry was probably more of a burden than a blessing. She would probably be relieved to have someone take responsibility for such valuable items. He knocked firmly, 3 sharp raps that echoed in the narrow hallway. Bradley? Margaret's voice came through the door, surprised. Is everything all right? You weren't supposed to visit until Sunday. We need to talk, Mom. Can I come in? Margaret opened the door, and Bradley was struck by how small she seemed. He had always remembered her as a formidable presence during his childhood, but now she appeared almost fragile in her worn cardigan and simple slippers. Her eyes, however, remained sharp and alert, taking in his tense expression and clenched jaw with the perceptiveness that had always made him slightly uncomfortable. Of course, honey, come in. Would you like some coffee? I just made a fresh pot. The apartment smelled like vanilla and old books, the same combination Bradley remembered from his childhood visits. But now he noticed things differently. The frayed edges on the sofa cushions, the carefully patched tear in the window curtain, the stack of coupon flyers on the coffee table. His mother was clearly cutting every corner possible to make ends meet, which made the jewelry situation even more infuriating. Mom, we need to have a serious conversation, Bradley began, declining the offer of coffee and remaining standing near the door. About your financial situation. About the family jewelry. About why you're living like this when you have assets sitting in your bedroom that could change everything. Margaret's expression didn't change, but Bradley caught something in her eyes. Was it fear? Sadness? He couldn't quite identify it, but it made him momentarily question his approach. Bradley, honey, please sit down. Let me get you that coffee, and we can talk about whatever's troubling you. Nothing's troubling me, Mom. What's troubling me is watching my own mother struggle to pay bills while she sits on a fortune in jewelry. What's troubling me is being turned down for loans and credit cards while you have diamonds and emeralds locked away in a box that you never even look at. The words came out harsher than Bradley had intended, but once they started, he couldn't stop them. Months of frustration and resentment poured out in a torrent that filled the small apartment. Jessica and I are drowning, Mom. Do you understand that? We can barely make rent. My truck needs repairs we can't afford. I can't get decent work because I don't have the right clothes for interviews. And I can't buy the right clothes because we don't have money. Meanwhile, you're sitting here with jewelry that belonged to Grandma Helen, to Great-Grandma Rose, pieces that are worth more than most people make in a year. Margaret sank slowly into her favorite chair, the one positioned near the window where she did her daily crossword puzzles. Her hands folded carefully in her lap, and she studied her son's face with an expression he couldn't read. Those pieces mean a great deal to me, Bradley, she said quietly. They're all I have left of my mother, of her mother, their family history. Family history doesn't pay bills, Mom. Bradley's voice rose despite his efforts to stay calm. Family history doesn't put food on the table or keep the lights on. And speaking of lights, when was the last time you bought yourself something nice? When was the last time you went out to dinner? Or took a trip? Or did anything besides worry about money? Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her gaze moving from Bradley's face to the small framed photograph on her side table. A picture of her late husband Robert, taken just months before his unexpected heart attack, had left her widowed at 38 with a 12-year-old son to raise alone. Your father and I always believed that some things were more valuable than money, she said finally. Those pieces represent love, commitment, family bonds that go back generations. They're not just jewelry, Bradley. They're sitting in a box while both of us struggle financially, Bradley interrupted. Don't you see how crazy that is? You could sell just one piece, just one, and probably solve both our problems. You could move to a nicer place, get your car fixed, stop worrying about every dollar. And Jessica and I could finally get ahead, instead of falling further behind every month. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Margaret studied her son's face, seeing so much of his father in his features, but none of Robert's gentle wisdom in his eyes. She saw desperation there, yes, but also something that worried her more, a sense of entitlement that had been growing for years, fed by his wife's constant dissatisfaction and his own inability to accept responsibility for his circumstances. Bradley, she said carefully, those pieces have been in our family for over a century. They were passed down to me with the understanding that I would care for them, preserve them, and eventually pass them on to the next generation. That's a responsibility I take very seriously. And I'm the next generation, Mom, Bradley's patience finally snapped completely. I'm your son. I'm the only family you have left. Those pieces are going to be mine eventually anyway, so why are we both suffering while they sit unused in your bedroom? The accusation hung in the air between them, stark and ugly in its directness. Margaret felt something cold settle in her chest. Not surprise, exactly, because she had seen this conversation coming for months, but a deep sadness at the realization that her son had become someone she barely recognized. Is that what you think? She asked quietly. That I'm keeping the jewelry from you out of spite? That I'm choosing to let both of us struggle financially for no reason? Bradley heard something in his mother's tone that gave him pause, but Jessica's voice echoed in his head, reminding him to stay firm, to not let emotion derail his mission. I think you've gotten so attached to these pieces that you can't see the practical reality of our situation, he said. I think you're letting sentiment cloud your judgment. Mom, I'm asking you directly. Will you give me the jewelry? Will you let me take it and sell what we need to sell so that both of us can have better lives? Margaret stood slowly, moving to the window where afternoon light was beginning to fade into early evening shadows. She could see the parking lot below, where Bradley's battered truck sat next to her own ancient sedan, both vehicles testament to the financial struggles they were both experiencing. You want the jewelry, she said, not looking at him. You believe it will solve your problems. Quote, I know it will solve our problems, Bradley replied firmly. Those pieces are worth a fortune, Mom. With that money, Jessica and I could buy a house, I could start my own business. We could actually build something, instead of just surviving paycheck to paycheck. Margaret turned from the window, and Bradley was surprised to see something like resignation in her expression. All right, she said quietly. If that's what you truly want, Bradley, if you believe the jewelry will make your life better, then you can have it. Bradley felt a surge of triumph mixed with relief. He had expected more resistance, more emotional manipulation, more appeals to family tradition and sentimental value. His mother's sudden capitulation caught him off guard, but he wasn't about to question his good fortune. Really? You'll give it to me? Margaret nodded slowly, already moving toward her bedroom. Yes, Bradley, you can have all of it, every single piece. As she disappeared into the bedroom, Bradley pulled out his phone to text Jessica the good news. He was already mentally calculating values, thinking about which pieces they might sell immediately and which ones they might hold on to for future emergencies. Their financial problems were finally going to be solved. He had no idea that his real problems were just beginning. When Margaret returned from the bedroom, She carried the ornate wooden jewelry box that Bradley remembered from his childhood. It was larger than he had expected, heavy enough that she needed both hands to carry it, and far more elaborate than seemed appropriate for someone living in such modest circumstances. "Here," she said, setting the box on her coffee table. "Everything I have is in here. Every piece that belonged to your grandmother, your great-grandmother, and the pieces that your father gave me over the years." Bradley approached the box with something approaching reverence. The wood was clearly antique, inlaid with what appeared to be mother-of-pearl in intricate patterns. The hinges were brass, polished to a warm glow despite their obvious age. Even the box itself probably had significant value. "Mom, are you sure about this?" The question slipped out before Bradley could stop it, some instinct making him hesitate at the last moment. Margaret smiled, but there was something sad and knowing in the expression that made Bradley uncomfortable. "I'm absolutely sure, honey. Open it. Take a look at your inheritance." Quote. Bradley's hands shook slightly as he lifted the lid of the ornate jewelry box. The late afternoon light streaming through his mother's apartment window caught the contents, creating sparkles and flashes that made his breath catch in his throat. Row upon row of necklaces, bracelets, rings, and earrings lay nestled in velvet compartments, each piece more elaborate than the last. "Jesus, Mom," he whispered, his voice filled with awe. This is incredible." Margaret remained seated in her chair by the window, watching her son's reaction with an expression that was difficult to read. Her fingers drummed silently against the arm of her chair, a nervous habit that Bradley was too focused on the jewelry to notice. Bradley carefully lifted a multi-strand pearl necklace, marveling at the weight and luster of what appeared to be perfectly matched pearls. The clasp was intricate goldwork, clearly antique, and the overall effect was breathtaking. He had never seen his mother wear this particular piece, though he vaguely remembered her mentioning that it had belonged to his great-grandmother Rose. These pearls alone must be worth, what, $50,000? $75,000? Bradley set the necklace aside and reached for a tennis bracelet that seemed to contain dozens of diamonds. The stones caught the light brilliantly, throwing tiny rainbows across the coffee table surface. "Mom, why didn't you ever tell me the collection was this extensive? I mean, I knew you had some nice pieces, but this is museum-quality stuff?" Margaret's smile grew more pronounced, though Bradley was too entranced by the jewelry to notice the peculiar quality of her expression. "Keep looking, honey. There's so much more." Bradley continued his exploration, each piece seeming more valuable than the last. An emerald and diamond ring that looked like something a Hollywood starlet might wear to the Academy Awards. A sapphire necklace with stones so deep blue they seemed to hold their own inner light. Earrings that featured what appeared to be flawless rubies surrounded by halos of tiny diamonds. "This is insane," Bradley muttered, pulling out his phone. "I need to call Jessica. She's not going to believe this." Jessica answered on the first ring, clearly having been waiting by the phone for news. "Well, did you get them?" "Jess, you're not going to believe what I'm looking at right now. This isn't just a few family pieces. This is I don't even know how to describe it. There must be hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of jewelry here, maybe more." Jessica's squeal of excitement was audible even to Margaret across the room. "Are you serious? Bradley, tell me you're being serious right now." "Dead serious. Mom just handed over the entire collection. We're looking at enough money to buy a house outright, start that business we talked about, maybe even invest for retirement. This changes everything, Jess. I'm coming over right now. Don't move anything until I get there. I want to see everything." Bradley ended the call and turned back to his mother, his face flushed with excitement and gratitude. "Mom, I don't know what to say. Thank you. Thank you for trusting me with this. I promise we'll be smart about it. We won't just blow through the money. We'll use it to build something real." Margaret nodded slowly. "I'm sure you will, Bradley. I'm sure you'll learn a great deal from this experience." Something in her tone made Bradley look at her more carefully, but before he could analyze her expression, Jessica's voice echoed from the hallway outside. She had clearly broken several speed limits getting to Margaret's apartment. "Bradley, where are you?" "In here, Jess. You're not going to believe this." Jessica burst through the door like a whirlwind, her eyes immediately locking onto the open jewelry box. She was a petite woman with shoulder-length blonde hair and sharp features that became more pronounced when she was excited or angry. Today, excitement dominated her expression as she rushed to the coffee table. "Oh my God," she breathed, sinking to her knees beside the box. "Oh my God, Margaret, this is incredible. These pieces are absolutely stunning." Jessica's hands hovered over the jewelry as if she were afraid to touch it, though her eyes were calculating, already mentally cataloging and appraising each piece. Bradley said there might be hundreds of thousands of dollars here. Looking at this quality, I think he might be conservative in his estimate. Jessica carefully lifted the sapphire necklace, holding it up to the light. "These stones are flawless. Absolutely flawless. And this setting, this is definitely antique, probably early 20th century craftsmanship." Margaret watched Jessica's examination with interest. "You seem to know quite a bit about jewelry, dear." Quote, "I worked at a jewelry store for 2 years before Bradley and I got married," Jessica explained, not taking her eyes off the sapphire necklace. "I learned to spot quality. And this, Margaret, this is museum-level quality. Some of these pieces should probably be insured for more than most people's houses are worth." Bradley felt a warm glow of vindication. He had been right to push for this conversation. His mother had been sitting on a literal fortune, while both their families struggled with basic expenses. It was almost criminal to let such valuable assets sit unused when they could transform their lives. "We should probably get these appraised properly," Bradley said, carefully placing a diamond and emerald bracelet back in its velvet compartment. "I mean, for insurance purposes, and to make sure we understand what we're dealing with." "Absolutely," Jessica agreed. "I actually know someone from my old job who does high-end appraisals. Marcus Chen. He specializes in estate jewelry and antique pieces. He'd be perfect for something like this." Margaret's eyebrows rose slightly. "You want to have them appraised right away?" "Well, yeah," Bradley said. "I mean, we need to know what we're working with before we make any decisions about selling or insurance or anything else. This isn't the kind of collection you just wing it with." "No," Margaret agreed quietly. "It certainly isn't." Jessica was already pulling out her phone. "I'm going to call Marcus right now. This is exactly the kind of collection he loves to work with. He might even be able to come out this week." As Jessica stepped into the kitchen to make her call, Bradley continued examining the jewelry. Each piece told a story. He could see the careful craftsmanship, the attention to detail, the obvious love that had gone into creating such beautiful objects. He found himself understanding, for the first time, why his mother had been reluctant to part with them. "Mom, these really are incredible family heirlooms," he said softly. "I'm starting to understand why they meant so much to you." Margaret's smile was gentle but enigmatic. "I'm glad you're beginning to appreciate them, Bradley. Really glad. I mean, obviously we'll need to sell some pieces to help with our immediate situation, but maybe we can keep a few of the most meaningful ones. Pass them down to our kids someday, you know?" "That sounds like a wonderful plan, honey." Jessica returned from the kitchen, her face bright with success. "Marcus can come tomorrow afternoon. He's as excited as I am. Apparently, he doesn't often get to work with collections this extensive. He said, based on my description, we might be looking at values that could require special security arrangements." Bradley felt a thrill of anticipation, mixed with a touch of nervousness. The idea that they might need special security arrangements for their newfound wealth was both exciting and slightly overwhelming. "Did you tell him these were family pieces?" Margaret asked. "Of course," Jessica replied. "He specializes in estate appraisals. He understands the emotional value as well as the monetary value of family collections." Margaret nodded approvingly. "Good. It's important that he understands the full context." The next 24 hours passed in a blur of excitement and planning. Bradley called in sick to his construction job, claiming a family emergency that required his immediate attention. Jessica spent hours researching jewelry values online, trying to get a preliminary sense of what they might be dealing with. They made lists of their immediate expenses, their long-term goals, and their dreams for how this windfall might change their lives. Bradley found himself barely able to sleep, his mind racing with possibilities. They could pay off all their debts immediately. They could buy a house in a good neighborhood, maybe even one with a workshop where Bradley could start his own contracting business. Jessica could go back to school, maybe get that business degree she had always wanted. They could travel, invest, build the kind of life they had only dreamed about. Even Margaret seemed caught up in their excitement, asking thoughtful questions about their plans and offering suggestions about financial planning and investment strategies that surprised Bradley with their sophistication. "You really think we should diversify the investments rather than putting everything into the business?" Bradley asked over coffee the morning of the appraisal. "Absolutely," Margaret replied firmly. "Your father always believed in spreading risk. Never put all your eggs in one basket, he used to say. Some in the business, some in real estate, some in conservative investments for security." Jessica nodded enthusiastically. "That's exactly what Marcus was saying when I talked to him yesterday. He said people who inherit valuable collections often make the mistake of either hoarding everything or liquidating everything. The smart approach is usually somewhere in the middle." When Marcus Chen arrived that afternoon, Bradley was impressed by his professionalism. He was a middle-aged Asian man with careful hands and magnifying equipment that looked expensive and sophisticated. He wore a suit that probably cost more than Bradley made in a month, and he handled the jewelry with the reverence of someone who truly understood its value. "Mrs. Whitfield," Marcus said as Margaret greeted him at the door, "your daughter-in-law described this as an extensive estate collection, but I have to say, even her description didn't prepare me for this level of quality." Marcus spread a black velvet cloth across Margaret's dining table and began laying out his equipment: digital scales, various magnifying devices, a small machine that Bradley assumed was for testing the authenticity of gemstones, and a tablet computer where he would apparently record his findings. "Now, I understand these pieces have been in your family for several generations?" Marcus asked as he carefully lifted the pearl necklace Bradley had first admired. "That's right," Margaret confirmed. "Some from my mother's side, some from my husband's family, and a few pieces that Robert gave me over the years." Marcus nodded, beginning his examination of the pearls with a level of focus that made the room fall silent. Bradley and Jessica watched anxiously as he used various tools to examine the surface, luster, and weight of the necklace. After several minutes, Marcus looked up with an expression that Bradley couldn't quite read. "Mrs. Whitfield, I need to ask you a question, and please don't take offense. Are you certain about the provenance of this particular piece?" Margaret's expression didn't change. "What do you mean?" "Well, these are beautiful pearls. Perfectly matched, excellent luster, clearly well maintained, but..." Marcus paused, looking uncomfortable. "They're cultured pearls, not natural. And the quality, while good, isn't quite what I would expect for a necklace of this apparent age and craftsmanship." Bradley felt a small chill of concern. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means this necklace, while attractive, is probably worth somewhere in the neighborhood of $800 to $1,200, not the $50,000 or more that the appearance might suggest." Jessica leaned forward, her voice sharp with concern. "Are you saying it's fake?" "Not fake, exactly. The pearls are real cultured pearls, and the gold clasp appears to be genuine. But it's not the museum-quality antique piece it appears to be. It's more likely a high-quality reproduction, probably made within the last 20 to 30 years. The room fell silent as the implications of Marcus's assessment sank in. Bradley felt his excitement begin to curdle into something approaching dread. Maybe that one piece isn't original," he said weakly. "What about the others?" Marcus's expression was sympathetic but professional as he reached for the sapphire necklace. "Let's continue the examination and see what we find." The next hour was a slow-motion nightmare for Bradley and Jessica. Piece after piece, Marcus's assessment remained consistent. The sapphires were beautiful synthetic stones, not natural gems. The diamonds were high-quality cubic zirconia. The gold settings were gold-plated silver, not solid gold. The emeralds were green glass, expertly crafted, but ultimately worthless. Every single piece in the collection was a reproduction, a fake, a beautifully crafted imitation of valuable jewelry that had fooled Bradley and Jessica completely but couldn't stand up to professional scrutiny. "I don't understand," Jessica said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They look so real. The craftsmanship is incredible." "Oh, the craftsmanship is excellent," Marcus agreed. "These are very high-quality reproductions. Someone spent considerable time and money creating pieces that would fool casual observation, but they're reproductions nonetheless." Bradley felt the world spinning around him. "What are you saying? What's the total value of the collection? Marcus consulted his tablet, adding up figures with the air of someone delivering bad news to a terminal patient. Taking into account the quality of the craftsmanship, the gold plating, and the overall artistic merit, I'd estimate the entire collection at somewhere between $8,000 and $12,000. Possibly 15 if you found the right collector who appreciated the artistry of the reproductions. The silence that followed was deafening. All of Bradley's dreams, all of Jessica's excitement, all of their plans for a transformed life crumbled in an instant. $15,000 might pay off their credit cards, but it wouldn't buy a house, start a business, or change their lives in any meaningful way. Bradley turned to look at his mother, who had remained silent throughout the entire appraisal process. She was sitting in her chair by the window, her hands folded in her lap, watching the proceedings with the same enigmatic expression she had worn since the previous day. "Mom," Bradley said slowly, "did you know?" Margaret met his eyes steadily. "Did I know what, honey? Did you know the jewelry was fake?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment, and Bradley saw something in her expression that made his stomach drop even further. "Bradley," she said gently, "I told you that you could have all the jewelry I possessed. I never told you it was valuable." The weight of Margaret's words hung in the air like a physical presence. Marcus Chen, clearly uncomfortable with the family tension that had erupted during his professional assessment, quietly began packing his equipment, while Bradley stared at his mother in stunned disbelief. "You knew," Bradley said, his voice flat and emotionless. "You knew the entire time that everything in that box was worthless, and you let me believe. You let us believe." "I let you believe what you chose to believe," Margaret replied calmly. "You saw what you wanted to see, Bradley. I never claimed the pieces were worth a fortune." Jessica, who had been silent since Marcus delivered his devastating assessment, suddenly found her voice. "But you wore them. You wore them to special occasions, to church, to family events. You acted like they were precious family heirlooms." Margaret's expression softened slightly. "They are precious to me, Jessica. Not because of their monetary value, but because of what they represent. Each piece in that collection has meaning that has nothing to do with dollars and cents." Marcus cleared his throat diplomatically. I'll send my detailed report to your email address, Mrs. Whitfield. If you have any questions about my assessment, please don't hesitate to contact me." He left quickly, clearly eager to escape the family drama that his professional services had unleashed. The sound of the apartment door closing seemed to echo through the small space, leaving the three family members alone with the wreckage of Bradley and Jessica's shattered dreams. Bradley stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with a harsh sound that made everyone wince. "I don't understand any of this. Why would you have an entire collection of fake jewelry? Why would you treat reproductions like they were priceless family heirlooms? None of this makes any sense." Margaret rose from her chair and moved to the small kitchen, her movements deliberate and calm despite the emotional storm swirling around her. "Would you like some coffee? This might be a long conversation." "I don't want coffee, Mom. I want answers." "And you'll have them," Margaret said, her voice carrying a note of steel that Bradley rarely heard. "But you're going to sit down, you're going to calm down, and you're going to listen. Because the story I'm about to tell you is going to change everything you think you know about your family, about me, and about why that collection exists." Something in her tone made Bradley and Jessica exchange glances. Despite their anger and disappointment, there was an authority in Margaret's voice that commanded attention. They sat. Margaret returned from the kitchen carrying 3 cups of coffee on a tray that Bradley recognized from his childhood. She set it down on the coffee table, carefully moving the jewelry box to make room, and then settled back into her chair, with the air of someone preparing to reveal long-held secrets. "Your father and I met when we were both working at Henderson & Associates downtown," she began, her voice taking on the cadence of someone telling a story that had been carefully rehearsed in her mind many times. "I was a junior accountant, fresh out of college. Robert was in the security department." Bradley frowned. "I thought Dad worked construction his whole life." "That came later," Margaret said. "Much later. At Henderson & Associates, your father was responsible for protecting some very valuable assets. The company specialized in estate management for wealthy families, and part of Robert's job was ensuring the security of jewelry collections, art pieces, and other high-value items during transport and storage. Jessica leaned forward, her anger temporarily replaced by curiosity. What kind of valuable assets? Margaret's smile was sad and knowing. The Henderson family had been managing estates for Cleveland's wealthiest families for over 60 years. They handled everything from property management to asset liquidation when families needed to raise cash quickly. And sometimes, when families faced financial difficulties but didn't want to publicly sell their valuable jewelry, Henderson and Associates would arrange for high-quality reproductions to be made. Quote, the implications of this revelation began to dawn on Bradley. Reproductions. The families could keep wearing their jewelry at social events, maintaining appearances, while the real pieces were quietly sold to cover debts or invested in more liquid assets. It was a service that saved face for many prominent Cleveland families during difficult economic periods. Margaret reached for the ornate jewelry box, running her fingers over the mother-of-pearl inlay with obvious affection. This box belonged to the Rothschild family. Not the famous European Rothschilds, but a wealthy Cleveland manufacturing family who lost most of their fortune in the 1980s recession. They came to Henderson and Associates for help. Jessica's eyes widened. And the jewelry in the box are the reproductions that were made for Mrs. Eleanor Rothschild. Exact replicas of pieces that had been in her family for 3 generations. The real jewelry was sold to help the family avoid bankruptcy, but Mrs. Rothschild couldn't bear the thought of appearing at social functions without her grandmother's sapphire necklace or her mother's pearl strand. Bradley felt a strange mixture of fascination and frustration. But why do you have them? Why do you have Mrs. Rothschild's fake jewelry? Margaret's expression grew more complex, and Bradley caught a glimpse of something in her eyes that looked almost like pride mixed with sadness. Because Mrs. Eleanor Rothschild was my mother. The silence that followed was complete. Bradley stared at his mother, as if she had suddenly begun speaking a foreign language. Jessica's coffee cup froze halfway to her lips. That's impossible, Bradley said finally. Your maiden name was Foster. Your parents were James and Helen Foster. They died when I was little, but I remember them. I remember Grandpa James and Grandma Helen. Margaret shook her head slowly. James and Helen Foster were Robert's parents, Bradley. They raised you for the first few years of your life because my own family situation was complicated. Bradley felt the world shifting beneath him again, different from the financial disappointment of discovering the jewelry was fake, but somehow more profound. What are you talking about? Margaret stood and walked to the small bookshelf in the corner of her living room. She pulled out a photo album that Bradley had seen many times over the years, but had never examined closely. She returned to her seat and opened it to a page near the beginning. This is my real family, she said, turning the album so Bradley and Jessica could see. The photograph showed a grand estate with manicured gardens and a mansion that looked like something from a movie. In front of the house stood a family of 4, a distinguished man in an expensive suit, an elegant woman wearing what appeared to be the same sapphire necklace they had just seen appraised, and 2 young girls in matching dresses. The older girl is my sister Catherine, Margaret said quietly. The younger one is me, Margaret Eleanor Rothschild. Bradley stared at the photograph, trying to reconcile the young girl in the expensive dress with the modest woman who had raised him in a series of small apartments and rental houses. I don't understand, he said weakly. If you're from this wealthy family, if your real name is Rothschild, then why? Why did we always struggle? Why did you work 3 jobs to put me through school? Why are you living in this apartment and worrying about paying bills? Margaret's laugh was bitter. Because by the time I inherited anything from the Rothschild estate, there was nothing left to inherit except debt and reproductions. Jessica found her voice. What happened to the money? My father, Charles Rothschild, was a brilliant businessman but a terrible judge of character. In the late 1970s, he partnered with a man named Vincent Morrison to expand the family manufacturing business into new markets. Morrison seemed charming, successful, and connected to all the right people in Cleveland's business community. Margaret turned the page in the photo album, revealing more pictures of family gatherings, social events, and what appeared to be business functions. What my father didn't know was that Morrison was systematically embezzling from the partnership, using the Rothschild name and reputation to secure loans he had no intention of repaying, and setting up shell companies to hide assets he was stealing from our legitimate businesses. Bradley studied the photographs, beginning to see familiar features in the faces of people he had never known existed. "So you lost everything?" "Worse than that," Margaret said. "By the time Morrison's schemes were discovered, the Rothschild name was associated with fraud, embezzlement, and bankruptcy. My parents faced criminal charges that were eventually dropped, but only after legal fees had consumed what little remained of our assets." She turned another page, revealing newspaper clippings with headlines that made Bradley's stomach clench. "Rothschild Manufacturing accused of investor fraud, and prominent Cleveland family faces bankruptcy. My father died of a heart attack 6 months after the scandal broke. My mother, Eleanor, fell into a severe depression and was hospitalized for most of my senior year of high school. My sister, Catherine." Margaret's voice trailed off, and Bradley saw pain flash across her features. "What happened to Catherine?" "Catherine couldn't handle the shame. She changed her name, moved to California, and told me she never wanted to see or hear from anyone associated with the Rothschild family again. As far as I know, she's still alive somewhere, but she made it clear that included me." Jessica leaned back in her chair, clearly overwhelmed by the scope of Margaret's revelations. "So you changed your name too?" "I took my mother's maiden name, Foster, and when people asked about my family, I let them assume I was related to Robert's parents. James and Helen Foster were kind people who understood that I needed to distance myself from the Rothschild scandal. They essentially adopted me as their own when Robert and I got married." Bradley felt a strange sense of vertigo, as if his entire understanding of his family history was dissolving and reforming into something completely different. But why keep the jewelry? Why keep the reproductions if they just reminded you of everything you lost? Margaret's expression softened, and for the first time since beginning her story, she looked genuinely emotional. "Because they're all I have left of my mother." Eleanor Rothschild spent her last years in a state psychiatric facility, convinced that she was still the wealthy society matron she had been before Morrison destroyed our family. She would ask the nurses to bring her jewelry so she could dress properly for imaginary social events. Margaret carefully lifted the pearl necklace from the jewelry box, holding it with obvious reverence. "When she died, the hospital gave me the few personal possessions she had been allowed to keep. The reproductions were among them. She had worn them every day, believing they were real, believing they connected her to the life and the family she had lost." Quote, Bradley watched his mother handle the fake pearls with the same careful attention he had seen her give to what he thought were priceless heirlooms. "Each piece represents a memory of my mother, my real mother, before the scandal and the depression and the psychiatric hospitals. When I wear the sapphire necklace to church, I remember the Christmas mornings when she would let me help her choose her jewelry for the holiday service. When I wear the diamond earrings to special occasions, I'm thinking about the time she would do my hair and let me watch her get ready for charity galas." Jessica's expression had shifted from confusion to something approaching understanding. "So the jewelry isn't about money at all?" "It never was," Margaret confirmed. "When you demanded the collection, Bradley, I realized you had never understood what those pieces meant to me. You saw dollar signs where I saw memories. You saw a financial opportunity where I saw the last connection to a family and a life that was stolen from me." Bradley felt a wave of shame wash over him, but it was quickly followed by another emotion he couldn't quite identify. "But Mom, if you're really Eleanor Rothschild's daughter, if you're from this wealthy family, then there might be other assets. There might be legal recourse against this Morrison person. There might be—" Margaret held up her hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "Bradley, this all happened over 40 years ago. Vincent Morrison died in 1987. Most of the people involved in the scandal are dead. The legal statutes of limitations expired decades ago." "But surely there's something," Jessica interjected. "I mean, if your family was as wealthy as you're describing, there had to be assets that Morrison couldn't steal. Property, investments, something." Margaret's smile was enigmatic. "You'd be surprised what a skilled criminal can steal when he has 40 years to work with and a family that trusts him completely." Bradley studied his mother's face, trying to read the expression he saw there. There was something she wasn't telling them, some piece of the story that remained hidden. "Mom," he said slowly, "is there more? Is there something else about the Rothschild family, about what happened to the money, that you haven't told us? Margaret closed the photo album and set it aside, then carefully began returning the jewelry to its velvet compartments in the ornate box. There's always more to every story, Bradley, she said quietly. The question is whether you're ready to hear it. Bradley couldn't sleep that night. He lay in the cramped bedroom he shared with Jessica in their rundown apartment, staring at the water stain on the ceiling while his mind raced through everything his mother had revealed. The modest woman who had raised him, who had worked multiple jobs to keep them afloat after his father's death, was actually the daughter of one of Cleveland's most prominent families. Jessica tossed and turned beside him, equally unable to rest. Finally, at 3 a.m, she sat up abruptly. "None of this makes sense," she whispered, not wanting to wake their downstairs neighbors who had already complained about noise. "If your mother is really from the Rothschild family, there has to be more to this story. Rich families don't just disappear without a trace." Bradley propped himself up on his elbow. "What do you mean?" "I mean, wealthy families have lawyers, Bradley. They have trusts, offshore accounts, property holdings that can't just be stolen by one person, no matter how clever he is. The kind of money your mother is describing doesn't just evaporate." Jessica swung her legs over the side of the bed and reached for her laptop. "I'm going to do some research." For the next 4 hours, Jessica dove deep into Cleveland's business history, searching for any records of the Rothschild family, Vincent Morrison, and the scandal that had allegedly destroyed one of the city's wealthiest dynasties. What she found was both more and less than she had expected. The newspaper archives confirmed Margaret's story about the scandal. In 1981, Rothschild Manufacturing had indeed been accused of defrauding investors. Charles Rothschild had died of a heart attack during the investigation. Eleanor Rothschild had been hospitalized for mental health issues. The family's assets had been liquidated to pay creditors and legal fees. But there were gaps in the story, inconsistencies that nagged at Jessica's analytical mind. "Bradley, wake up," she said, shaking her husband's shoulder as dawn light began filtering through their thin curtains. "I found something weird." Bradley groggily accepted the coffee Jessica had made and listened as she explained her findings. According to the public records, the Rothschild family owned way more than just the manufacturing business. They had residential properties, commercial real estate, investment portfolios, and even a private foundation that funded arts programs in Cleveland. But here's the thing. All of these assets were sold or transferred in a very specific pattern. Jessica turned her laptop screen toward Bradley, showing him a spreadsheet she had created tracking the disposal of Rothschild assets. "Look at the dates. Everything was sold between March and August of 1981, right after the scandal broke. But the sales weren't random. They followed a very deliberate sequence, almost like someone was following a predetermined plan." Bradley squinted at the screen, trying to make sense of the financial data. "What kind of plan?" "The kind of plan that someone makes when they want to hide assets, not liquidate them," Jessica said, her excitement growing. "Look, the family mansion was sold to something called Phoenix Holdings LLC for way below market value. 3 months later, Phoenix Holdings sold it to Morrison Development Group for 10 times what they paid." The implications began to dawn on Bradley. "You think Morrison was using shell companies to buy the family's assets for cheap?" "I think Morrison was stealing everything systematically, using the legal chaos of the investigation to cover his tracks. But Bradley, here's the really interesting part. According to state incorporation records, Phoenix Holdings LLC was dissolved in 1985, but the assets it acquired were never transferred to Morrison Development Group." Jessica clicked to another screen, showing corporate filings that meant nothing to Bradley, but clearly excited his wife. Which means legally, all those assets are in limbo. Phoenix Holdings owned them when it was dissolved, but there's no record of who inherited them when the company ceased to exist. Bradley felt a familiar surge of hope, quickly followed by suspicion. This felt too much like the previous day's fantasy about the jewelry being valuable. "What are you saying, Jess? That there's still Rothschild money out there somewhere?" "I'm saying your mother either doesn't know the full story, or she's not telling us everything she knows, and I think we need to find out which one it is." They arrived at Margaret's apartment that morning with Jessica's laptop and a folder full of printed documents. Margaret greeted them at the door with fresh coffee and homemade muffins, as if the previous day's emotional revelations hadn't happened. "You're both up early," she observed, noting their somewhat disheveled appearance and the intensity in Jessica's eyes. "Mom, we need to talk more about the Rothschild family," Bradley said without preamble. "Jessica did some research last night, and there are things about the asset liquidation that don't add up." Margaret's expression didn't change, but Bradley caught something that might have been a flicker of resignation across her features. "I see. And what did you find?" Jessica spread her printed documents across Margaret's dining table with the efficiency of a prosecutor laying out evidence. "We found that Vincent Morrison didn't just embezzle from your family. He orchestrated one of the most sophisticated asset theft schemes in Cleveland's history." Margaret sat down slowly, studying the papers Jessica had arranged. "Go on." "Morrison created at least 12 different shell companies between 1979 and 1983, Jessica continued. Each one was designed to purchase Rothschild assets at below-market prices during the chaos of the investigation. But here's the thing, Margaret. Most of those shell companies were dissolved within a few years, and their assets were never properly transferred." Bradley leaned forward. "What Jessica is saying is that legally, a lot of the Rothschild family assets might still exist, but they're trapped in defunct corporations that Morrison created and then abandoned." Margaret's fingers drummed against the table, a nervous habit Bradley had noticed the day before. "And you think this means what, exactly?" Jessica pulled out a legal document she had printed from the Ohio Secretary of State's website. "It means that as the surviving heir of Charles Rothschild, you might have legal standing to claim those abandoned assets. Morrison is dead, but the companies he created to steal from your family left a paper trail that could lead to recovering millions of dollars." The silence that followed was heavy with possibility and tension. Margaret studied the documents carefully, and Bradley could see her mind working behind her calm exterior. "You've done very thorough research, Jessica," Margaret said finally. "Very thorough indeed." "So you knew?" Bradley asked. "You knew about the shell companies and the asset transfers?" Margaret stood and walked to her kitchen window, looking out at the parking lot where her aging sedan sat next to Bradley's battered truck. "I've known for a very long time that Vincent Morrison's theft was more complex than the authorities ever discovered." Jessica's voice was sharp with frustration. "Then why didn't you do anything about it? Why are you living in this apartment, worrying about bills, when there might be millions of dollars in assets waiting to be recovered?" Margaret turned from the window, and Bradley was surprised to see something that looked like amusement in her expression. "Who says I haven't done anything about it?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Bradley felt the familiar sensation of the ground shifting beneath him, the same disorientation he had experienced when learning about the fake jewelry and his mother's true identity. "What do you mean?" he asked carefully. Margaret returned to the table and sat down, her demeanor suddenly more focused and businesslike than Bradley had ever seen. "Bradley, what do you know about Morrison Development Group?" "Just what Jessica found in her research. That it was one of the companies Morrison used to buy stolen Rothschild assets." "Morrison Development Group is still in business," Margaret said quietly. "It's one of Cleveland's most successful real estate development companies. They've built half the luxury condominiums downtown, they own 3 of the city's most prestigious shopping centers, and they're currently developing that new waterfront district that's been in all the newspapers." Jessica frowned. "But Vincent Morrison died in 1987. Who's running the company now?" "His son, Vincent Morrison Jr., and his grandson, Vincent Morrison III. 3 generations of Morrisons building their empire on assets stolen from my family." Bradley felt anger beginning to build in his chest. "And you've just let them get away with it? For 40 years, you've let these people profit from what they stole from your family?" Margaret's smile was sharp and cold, completely unlike any expression Bradley had ever seen on his mother's face. "Oh, Bradley, I haven't let them get away with anything." She stood and walked to her bedroom, returning a moment later with a manila folder that looked official and well organized. She set it on the table and opened it, revealing what appeared to be legal documents, financial statements, and correspondence. "For the past 15 years, I have been systematically documenting every asset that Vincent Morrison stole from my family. Every shell company, every fraudulent transfer, every piece of property that was illegally acquired using Rothschild money. Jessica leaned over the documents, her eyes widening as she recognized some of the company names and property addresses. These are current documents. These are from this year. I've been building a legal case that will not only recover every penny Morrison stole, but will also include 40 years of interest, damages, and penalties that will effectively destroy Morrison Development Group and everyone associated with it. Bradley stared at his mother as if seeing her for the first time. You're going to sue them? After all these years, you're finally going to sue them? Margaret's expression was patient, as if she were explaining something obvious to a slow child. I'm not going to sue them, Bradley. I'm going to destroy them completely, but not through the courts. Jessica looked up from the documents. Then how? Margaret walked back to her kitchen and returned with a business card that she placed on the table next to the legal documents. Bradley picked it up and read it twice before the words sank in. Phoenix Holdings, LLC, he read aloud. Margaret Foster, Chief Executive Officer. The silence that followed was absolute. Bradley looked from the business card to his mother's face, trying to process what he was seeing. You're Phoenix Holdings? I have been with Phoenix Holdings for the past 23 years, Margaret confirmed. The company that Vincent Morrison created to steal my family's assets? The company that was supposedly dissolved in 1985? I bought it from the state when it was declared abandoned property, for $50 and the cost of filing fees. Jessica's voice was barely a whisper. Which means I legally own every asset that Morrison transferred to Phoenix Holdings when he was stealing from my family. The mansion where I grew up, I own it. The commercial properties downtown, I own them. The investment accounts he thought he had hidden, I control them. Bradley felt dizzy. But why are you living here? Why are you working and struggling and acting like you have no money if you own all of this? Margaret's smile was genuinely warm for the first time since she had begun revealing her secrets. Because, my dear son, revenge is a dish best served cold. And I have been waiting a very long time for the right moment to serve it. Quote. She gathered the documents back into their folder and closed it with a decisive snap. Tomorrow morning, Vincent Morrison III will arrive at his office to discover that Morrison Development Group no longer exists. Every property they thought they owned, every asset they believed was theirs, every business deal they have in progress, all of it belongs to Phoenix Holdings. All of it belongs to me. Bradley's mind reeled with the implications. You're going to take everything from them? Everything they stole from my family, yes. Plus interest. Plus the value they've added through improvements and development. Plus the emotional damage of watching my mother die believing she was a pauper when she was actually quite wealthy. Jessica was frantically flipping through the documents Margaret had shown them. The legal paperwork for this must be incredibly complex. How did you manage all of this on your own? Margaret's laugh was genuinely amused. Who says I've been doing it on my own? Did you really think a woman who raised a child as a single mother while working 3 jobs wouldn't know how to network and build alliances? She walked to her phone and dialed a number from memory. David, it's Margaret. Yes, everything is ready for tomorrow. No, there haven't been any complications. Actually, there has been one small change. I want my son and daughter-in-law to be there when we serve the papers. Bradley watched his mother make arrangements with someone who was clearly a lawyer, speaking with the confidence and authority of someone who had been planning a complex legal strategy for decades. When she hung up the phone, she turned to face her son and daughter-in-law with an expression that was both loving and slightly terrifying. Now, she said, would you like to know what you're going to inherit when this is all over? The Morrison Development Group headquarters occupied an entire city block in downtown Cleveland's most prestigious business district. The glass and steel tower reflected the morning sun like a monument to corporate success, its lobby adorned with awards, photographs of luxury developments, and portraits of 3 generations of Morrison leadership. Bradley felt underdressed in his best khakis and button-down shirt as he followed his mother through the marble-floored entrance. Margaret, however, moved with the confidence of someone who belonged in such surroundings. I have to admit, Morrison said as they settled into leather chairs around a conference table, When my assistant said Margaret Rothschild was here about Phoenix Holdings, I thought there must be some mistake. The Rothschild family, well, that's ancient history. Margaret opened her purse and withdrew a manila envelope. Not as ancient as you might think, Vincent. May I call you Vincent? Of course. And please, tell me what brings you here today. Phoenix Holdings, that name does sound familiar, but I can't quite place it. Margaret's laugh was soft and knowing. Phoenix Holdings was one of the shell companies your grandfather created in 1981 to purchase Rothschild family assets during our difficulties. Surely your family discussed this history with you? Morrison's professional demeanor slipped slightly. Ms. Rothschild, I think there may be some confusion. My grandfather's business dealings from the 1980s are not something I'm intimately familiar with, but I can assure you that Morrison Development Group has always operated with complete legal integrity. Oh, I'm sure you believe that, Margaret said, sliding documents across the conference table. But I think you'll find these records quite illuminating. Morrison picked up the first document and began reading. As his eyes moved down the page, his confident expression gradually transformed into something approaching alarm. This appears to be a corporate ownership filing, he said slowly. It says that Phoenix Holdings LLC owns... This can't be right. The Rothschild Mansion on Shaker Heights Boulevard? Margaret supplied helpfully. Yes, Phoenix Holdings has owned that property since 1981. Morrison Development Group has been paying property taxes and maintenance costs on a house they never actually owned. Morrison flipped to the next document, his face growing paler. The Westfield Shopping Plaza, that's been our most profitable property for 20 years. Also owned by Phoenix Holdings, which purchased it from Rothschild Investments in 1982 for substantially below market value. Your grandfather was quite clever in his theft, Vincent, but he wasn't as thorough as he thought. Jessica watched Morrison's reaction with fascination. This was a man who had built his career on inherited success, never questioning the foundation of his family's wealth. Now that foundation was crumbling in real time. This is impossible, Morrison said, but his voice lacked conviction. Phoenix Holdings was dissolved decades ago. These documents can't be valid. Margaret reached into her purse again and produced a business card, sliding it across the table. Phoenix Holdings, LLC, was reincorporated in 2001 under Ohio's abandoned property statutes. I am the current chief executive officer, and these documents represent a small sample of the assets your family has been illegally occupying for the past 40 years. Morrison stared at the business card, as if it were a venomous snake. You're claiming ownership of Morrison Development Group properties based on shell companies from the 1980s? That's insane. Our lawyers will tear this apart in court. Your lawyers are welcome to try, Margaret said calmly. But they'll discover that every transfer, every sale, every development project your family has undertaken using stolen Rothschild assets is legally invalid. Phoenix Holdings has been documenting everything for over 20 years. Bradley watched his mother with growing amazement. This was not the modest widow who had raised him. This was a corporate strategist with decades of planning behind every word. Morrison stood abruptly, pacing to his windows. What do you want? Money? Some kind of settlement? We can work something out that's reasonable for everyone. I want exactly what your grandfather stole from my family, Margaret replied. Every property, every asset, every dollar of profit generated using Rothschild money, plus interest calculated over 40 years, plus damages for the emotional trauma your family's theft caused my mother and sister. That would destroy Morrison Development Group. Margaret's smile was cold. Yes, it would. The office fell silent except for the muffled sounds of traffic from the street 32 floors below. Morrison stood at his windows, staring out at a city where many of the buildings his family had developed were about to be revealed as built on stolen foundations. There has to be another solution, Morrison said finally, some way to resolve this that doesn't involve destroying everything my family has built. Margaret stood and walked to the wall where Morrison's civic awards were displayed. Your family built nothing, Vincent. Your grandfather stole the capital, my family's reputation, and 40 years of my life. Your father and you simply continued to profit from that theft. She turned to face him directly. But I'm not unreasonable. There is one way to avoid total destruction. Morrison's head snapped up with desperate hope. What? Public confession. A complete admission of your grandfather's crimes, published in the Cleveland Plain Dealer, along with a detailed accounting of every asset stolen from the Rothschild family, plus immediate transfer of all properties back to Phoenix Holdings, plus personal apologies to me and my family. That's professional suicide, Morrison protested. No one in Cleveland would ever do business with us again. Exactly, Margaret said. The same kind of social destruction your grandfather inflicted on my family. The same shame and humiliation that drove my mother to a psychiatric hospital and my sister to abandon her family name. Bradley realized he was witnessing something that had been 40 years in the making. His mother hadn't just been surviving since the Rothschild scandal. She had been planning, building, and positioning herself for this exact moment. Morrison sank back into his chair, looking suddenly older and more fragile. How long have you been planning this? Since the day I watched my mother die, believing she was penniless while your family lived in the mansion that should have been her nursing home, Margaret replied. Since the day I realized that justice delayed is not justice denied if you're patient enough and smart enough to wait for the right moment. Jessica opened the briefcase Margaret had given her and withdrew a thick stack of documents. These are the legal filings that will be submitted to Ohio State Court at 5 p.m. today unless Mr. Morrison agrees to the terms my mother-in-law has outlined. Every property, every asset, every business relationship Morrison Development Group believes it owns will be frozen pending litigation that could take years to resolve. Morrison looked at the documents with the expression of a man watching his execution warrant being prepared. You're giving me until 5 p.m. to choose between public humiliation and legal destruction? Margaret checked her watch. It's currently 10:30 a.m., so you have 6.5 hours to make your decision. I'd suggest you use that time to consult with your legal team, your family, and perhaps a good public relations firm. She gathered her purse and stood to leave. Oh, and Vincent? You might want to call your father. I believe he's still alive, isn't he? He may remember more details about your grandfather's business practices than you've been told. Quote. As they waited for the elevator, Bradley could hear Morrison on his phone, his voice rising in panic as he tried to explain the situation to someone who was clearly not understanding the gravity of what was happening. In the elevator descending to the lobby, Jessica finally found her voice. Margaret, that was incredible. But are you really prepared to destroy an entire family business over something that happened 40 years ago? Margaret's reflection in the polished elevator doors showed an expression Bradley had never seen. Satisfied, determined, and completely without mercy. Jessica dear, I've been destroying Morrison Development Group for decades. Today is just the day they find out about it. The Morrison Development Group headquarters occupied an entire city block in downtown Cleveland's most prestigious business district. The glass and steel tower reflected the morning sun like a monument to corporate success, its lobby adorned with awards, photographs of luxury developments, and portraits of 3 generations of Morrison leadership. Bradley felt underdressed in his best khakis and button-down shirt as he followed his mother through the marble-floored entrance. Margaret, however, moved with the confidence of someone who belonged in such surroundings. She wore a simple but elegant navy dress that Bradley had never seen before, along with the sapphire necklace from her jewelry collection, the fake one that now carried entirely different meaning. Are you sure about this, Mom? Bradley whispered as they approached the reception desk. These people have been successful for decades. They're not going to just roll over because you show up with some old legal documents. Margaret's smile was serene. Trust me, Bradley. Jessica walked slightly behind them, carrying a briefcase that Margaret had given her. Inside were copies of the documents they would need, though Margaret had assured them that the originals were already in the hands of her legal team. Good morning, Margaret said to the receptionist, a young woman with perfectly styled blonde hair and a professional smile. I'm here to see Vincent Morrison III. I don't have an appointment, but I believe he'll want to see me. Please tell him that Margaret Rothschild is here to discuss Phoenix Holdings. The receptionist's smile faltered slightly. I'm sorry, but Mr. Morrison is in meetings all morning. If you'd like to schedule... Please make the call, Margaret interrupted gently. Use exactly those words. Margaret Rothschild, Phoenix Holdings. He'll understand. 5 minutes later, they were in the elevator heading to the 32nd floor. The receptionist had made the call, spoken briefly with someone, then hung up with a confused expression and immediately arranged for their escort upstairs. Vincent Morrison III was waiting for them when the elevator doors opened. He was a man in his early 50s, with silver hair, an expensive suit, and the kind of polished appearance that came from generations of wealth and privilege. But Bradley noticed something in his eyes that looked like nervousness. "Ms. Rothschild," Morrison said, extending his hand with practiced corporate charm. "This is unexpected. Please come to my office." Morrison's corner office was a testament to success and power. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Lake Erie, and the walls were covered with architectural renderings of Morrison developments, photos of ribbon-cutting ceremonies, and civic awards. Behind his massive oak desk hung a portrait of Vincent Morrison Sr., the man who had destroyed Margaret's family. "I have to admit," Morrison said as they settled into leather chairs around a conference table, "when my assistant said Margaret Rothschild was here about Phoenix Holdings, I thought there must be some mistake. The Rothschild family, well, that's ancient history." Margaret opened her purse and withdrew a manila envelope. "Not as ancient as you might think, Vincent. May I call you Vincent?" "Of course. And please, tell me what brings you here today." "Phoenix Holdings. That name does sound familiar, but I can't quite place it." Margaret's laugh was soft and knowing. "Phoenix Holdings was one of the shell companies your grandfather created in 1981 to purchase Rothschild family assets during our difficulties. Surely your family discussed this history with you?" Morrison's professional demeanor slipped slightly. "Ms. Rothschild, I think there may be some confusion. My grandfather's business dealings from the 1980s are not something I'm intimately familiar with, but I can assure you that Morrison Development Group has always operated with complete legal integrity." "Oh, I'm sure you believe that," Margaret said, sliding documents across the conference table, "but I think you'll find these records quite illuminating." Morrison picked up the first document and began reading. As his eyes moved down the page, his confident expression gradually transformed into something approaching alarm. "This appears to be a corporate ownership filing," he said slowly. "It says that Phoenix Holdings LLC owns, this can't be right." "The Rothschild Mansion on Shaker Heights Boulevard," Margaret supplied helpfully. "Yes, Phoenix Holdings has owned that property since 1981. Morrison Development Group has been paying property taxes and maintenance costs on a house they never actually owned." Morrison flipped to the next document, his face growing paler. "The Westfield Shopping Plaza. That's been our most profitable property for 20 years. Also owned by Phoenix Holdings, which purchased it from Rothschild Investments in 1982 for substantially below market value. Your grandfather was quite clever in his theft, Vincent, but he wasn't as thorough as he thought." Jessica watched Morrison's reaction with fascination. This was a man who had built his career on inherited success, never questioning the foundation of his family's wealth. Now that foundation was crumbling in real time. "This is impossible," Morrison said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Phoenix Holdings was dissolved decades ago. These documents can't be valid." Margaret reached into her purse again and produced a business card, sliding it across the table. "Phoenix Holdings, LLC, was reincorporated in 2001 under Ohio's abandoned property statutes. I am the current chief executive officer, and these documents represent a small sample of the assets your family has been illegally occupying for the past 40 years. Morrison stared at the business card, as if it were a venomous snake. "You're claiming ownership of Morrison Development Group properties based on shell companies from the 1980s. That's insane. Our lawyers will tear this apart in court." "Your lawyers are welcome to try," Margaret said calmly. "But they'll discover that every transfer, every sale, every development project your family has undertaken using stolen Rothschild assets is legally invalid. Phoenix Holdings has been documenting everything for over 20 years." Bradley watched his mother with growing amazement. This was not the modest widow who had raised him. This was a corporate strategist, with decades of planning behind every word. Morrison stood abruptly, pacing to his windows. "What do you want, money? Some kind of settlement? We can work something out that's reasonable for everyone." Quote, "I want exactly what your grandfather stole from my family," Margaret replied. Every property, every asset, every dollar of profit generated using Rothschild money, plus interest calculated over 40 years, plus damages for the emotional trauma your family's theft caused my mother and sister. That would destroy Morrison Development Group. Margaret's smile was cold. Yes, it would. The office fell silent except for the muffled sounds of traffic from the street 32 floors below. Morrison stood at his windows, staring out at a city where many of the buildings his family had developed were about to be revealed as built on stolen foundations. There has to be another solution, Morrison said finally, some way to resolve this that doesn't involve destroying everything my family has built. Margaret stood and walked to the wall where Morrison's civic awards were displayed. Your family built nothing, Vincent. Your grandfather stole the capital, my family's reputation, and 40 years of my life. Your father and you simply continued to profit from that theft. She turned to face him directly. But I'm not unreasonable. There is one way to avoid total destruction. Morrison's head snapped up with desperate hope. What? Public confession. A complete admission of your grandfather's crimes, published in the Cleveland Plain Dealer, along with a detailed accounting of every asset stolen from the Rothschild family, plus immediate transfer of all properties back to Phoenix Holdings, plus personal apologies to me and my family. That's professional suicide, Morrison protested. No one in Cleveland would ever do business with us again. Exactly, Margaret said. The same kind of social destruction your grandfather inflicted on my family. The same shame and humiliation that drove my mother to a psychiatric hospital and my sister to abandon her family name. Bradley realized he was witnessing something that had been 40 years in the making. His mother hadn't just been surviving since the Rothschild scandal. She had been planning, building, and positioning herself for this exact moment. Morrison sank back into his chair, looking suddenly older and more fragile. How long have you been planning this? Since the day I watched my mother die believing she was penniless while your family lived in the mansion that should have been her nursing home, Margaret replied. Since the day I realized that justice delayed is not justice denied if you're patient enough and smart enough to wait for the right moment. Jessica opened the briefcase Margaret had given her and withdrew a thick stack of documents. These are the legal filings that will be submitted to Ohio State Court at 5 p.m. today, unless Mr. Morrison agrees to the terms my mother-in-law has outlined. Every property, every asset, every business relationship Morrison Development Group believes it owns will be frozen pending litigation that could take years to resolve. Morrison looked at the documents with the expression of a man watching his execution warrant being prepared. You're giving me until 5 p.m. to choose between public humiliation and legal destruction? Margaret checked her watch. It's currently 10:30 a.m., so you have 6.5 hours to make your decision. I'd suggest you use that time to consult with your legal team, your family, and perhaps a good public relations firm. She gathered her purse and stood to leave. Oh, and Vincent? You might want to call your father. I believe he's still alive, isn't he? He may remember more details about your grandfather's business practices than you've been told. As they waited for the elevator, Bradley could hear Morrison on his phone, his voice rising in panic as he tried to explain the situation to someone who was clearly not understanding the gravity of what was happening. In the elevator descending to the lobby, Jessica finally found her voice. Margaret, that was incredible. But are you really prepared to destroy an entire family business over something that happened 40 years ago? Margaret's reflection in the polished elevator doors showed an expression Bradley had never seen, satisfied, determined, and completely without mercy. Jessica, dear, I've been destroying Morrison Development Group for decades. Today is just the day they find out about it. The elevator doors opened to reveal the marble lobby bustling with morning business activity. As they walked toward the exit, Bradley noticed several people in expensive suits huddled in urgent conversations, their phones pressed to their ears. Word was already spreading through Cleveland's tight-knit business community. Mom, Bradley said as they reached the sidewalk, I need to understand something. If you've owned all these properties for 20 years, where has the money been going? The rental income, the profits from Morrison's developments, that has to be millions of dollars. Margaret hailed a taxi with the confidence of someone accustomed to city life. The Rothschild Family Foundation, she said as they climbed into the cab. Every penny of profit generated by assets stolen from my family has been going into charitable works in Cleveland. Healthcare for the indigent, scholarships for underprivileged students, housing for the homeless. Jessica's eyes widened. You've been giving it all away? My mother believed deeply in philanthropy, Margaret explained. Before the scandal, the Rothschild family donated millions to Cleveland's cultural institutions, hospitals, and educational programs. I've simply continued that tradition using the money that should have been hers. The taxi pulled away from Morrison Tower, and Bradley watched the building shrink in the rear window. Somewhere up on the 32nd floor, Vincent Morrison III was probably having the worst day of his professional life. But why live so modestly? Bradley asked. Why work those jobs? Why struggle with bills? Why let me grow up thinking we were poor? Margaret's expression grew thoughtful. Because I needed to understand what it meant to live without the Rothschild name and fortune. I needed to experience the life that Vincent Morrison Sr. condemned me to when he stole everything from my family. How could I seek justice if I didn't truly comprehend what had been taken from us? The taxi stopped at a red light, and Margaret pointed to a modern building across the street. See that medical center? The Rothschild Foundation funded the entire pediatric wing. 40 beds for children whose families can't afford private health care. Bradley stared at the building, trying to reconcile this information with his image of his mother as a struggling single parent. How many projects has the foundation funded? Over the past 20 years, 63 major initiatives. We've built affordable housing, funded medical research, established job training programs, and provided college scholarships for over 300 students. Margaret's voice carried quiet pride. Your father would have been proud of what we accomplished with Morrison's stolen money. Jessica pulled out her phone and began searching. The Rothschild Foundation, here it is, says it's one of Cleveland's most significant charitable organizations. She scrolled through the website, her expression growing more amazed. Margaret, this foundation has donated over $50 million in the past 2 decades. $57 million to be precise, Margaret corrected. Every cent that Morrison Development Group thought they were earning has been redirected to help the people of Cleveland. In a way, Vincent Morrison Sr.'s theft has probably done more good for this city than he ever could have imagined. The taxi arrived at their destination, a modest coffee shop in Cleveland's University Circle district. Margaret paid the driver and led them inside to a corner booth, where a distinguished-looking man in his 60s was already waiting. Bradley, Jessica, I'd like you to meet David Brennan, Margaret said as they sat down. He's been my attorney for the past 15 years. Brennan stood to shake their hands with the firm grip of someone accustomed to high-stakes negotiations. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his suit was clearly expensive, and his eyes held the sharp intelligence of a legal strategist. David was the junior associate who first discovered the Phoenix Holdings loophole, Margaret explained. He's been instrumental in building the case against Morrison Development Group. Brennan smiled modestly. Your mother-in-law is being generous. She did most of the investigative work herself. I've simply helped ensure that everything we've uncovered will hold up in court. Jessica leaned forward eagerly. So the legal case is solid? Morrison can't fight this? Fight it? He can try, Brennan said, opening his briefcase and withdrawing a thick folder. But Margaret has spent 2 decades documenting every illegal transfer, every fraudulent transaction, and every dollar of profit generated using stolen Rothschild assets. This isn't just a civil case, it's a criminal conspiracy that spans 40 years. Bradley felt a chill run down his spine. Criminal conspiracy? Vincent Morrison Sr. didn't just embezzle money, Brennan explained. He created false corporations, forged documents, bribed officials, and systematically defrauded investors while using the Rothschild name to legitimize his schemes. Under Ohio law, there's no statute of limitations on ongoing criminal enterprises. Margaret sipped her coffee calmly. David has identified 12 separate felonies that Morrison Sr. committed, and Vincent Morrison Jr. and III have continued to benefit from those crimes for decades. Legally, they're accessories after the fact. Which means, Brennan continued, that even if they agree to Margaret's terms for returning the stolen property, they could still face criminal prosecution. The state attorney general has been very interested in our findings. Jessica's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her coffee cup. You're talking about sending people to prison. I'm talking about justice, Margaret said firmly. My mother died believing she was a pauper because of Vincent Morrison Sr.'s crimes. My sister abandoned her family name and has lived in exile for 40 years because of the shame he brought on us. The Morrison family has profited from stolen money while the real owners suffered in poverty and disgrace. Brennan checked his watch. It's almost noon. Morrison will probably start reaching out to his legal team soon. We should expect some aggressive pushback. As if summoned by his words, Margaret's phone rang. She glanced at the caller ID and smiled grimly. Vincent Morrison 3, right on schedule. She answered the call, putting it on speaker so the others could hear. Morrison's voice was tight with barely controlled panic. Ms. Rothschild, I've been in touch with our attorneys. They say your claims are ambitious. But they also say you might have some valid points about the historical transactions. How diplomatic of them, Margaret replied dryly. I'd like to propose a meeting this afternoon if possible. My father is flying in from Florida, and we'd like to discuss a reasonable resolution to this situation. Margaret exchanged glances with Brennan, who nodded slightly. What did you have in mind, Vincent? Our conference room, 3 p.m. You, your legal counsel, and perhaps we can find a middle ground that works for everyone. And if we can't find that middle ground? Morrison's pause was telling. Then I suppose we'll see what happens at 5 p.m. Margaret ended the call and turned to Brennan. What do you think? I think Vincent Morrison Jr. remembers more about his father's business practices than his son realizes, Brennan said. This could be very interesting. Bradley watched his mother prepare for what might be the final confrontation with the family that had destroyed hers. She sat straighter, her expression hardening into something approaching steel. This was a woman who had spent 40 years planning for justice, and she was finally within hours of achieving it. Mom, Bradley said quietly, whatever happens this afternoon, I want you to know that I'm proud of you. I'm proud of everything you've accomplished, everything you've built with the foundation, and everything you've done to honor Dad's memory and your family's legacy. Margaret's expression softened for the first time that day. Thank you, Bradley. That means more to me than you know. Jessica reached across the table and took Margaret's hand. We're going to be there with you. Whatever happens next, you're not facing it alone. Margaret squeezed Jessica's hand gratefully. Then let's go finish what Vincent Morrison Sr. started 40 years ago. The Morrison Development Group conference room at 3 p.m. was a stark contrast to the morning's earlier meeting. Gone was Vincent Morrison III's confident corporate demeanor, replaced by the tense atmosphere of a family in crisis. The younger Morrison sat flanked by two expensive-looking attorneys, while across from him sat an older man who could only be his father, Vincent Morrison Jr. Bradley studied Morrison Jr. with fascination. At 73, he bore a striking resemblance to the portrait of Vincent Morrison Sr. that hung in the executive office. The same sharp features, the same calculating eyes, but now dimmed with age and what appeared to be genuine fear. Margaret entered the conference room with David Brennan and two additional attorneys Bradley had never seen before. She had changed clothes again, this time into a charcoal gray business suit that transformed her from modest widow into corporate powerhouse. The sapphire necklace still graced her throat, but now it seemed less like costume jewelry and more like a battle standard. Vincent, Margaret said, addressing the older Morrison directly, it's been a very long time. Morrison Jr.'s hands trembled slightly as he stood to greet her. Margaret Rothschild, I wondered if this day would ever come. Did you? Margaret's voice was cool and measured. Because I never wondered. I always knew it would. The attorneys on Morrison's side shuffled papers nervously, clearly having been briefed on the scope of the legal disaster facing their clients. One of them, a sharp-faced woman in her 40s, leaned forward to take control of the conversation. Ms. Rothschild, I'm Patricia Walsh, lead counsel for Morrison Development Group. We've reviewed the documents your attorney provided, and while we acknowledge there may be some irregularities in historical transactions, we believe the statute of limitations on any potential claims expired decades ago. David Brennan smiled with the confidence of someone holding a royal flush. Ms. Walsh, I'm afraid you're operating under a fundamental misunderstanding of Ohio law regarding ongoing criminal enterprises. There is no statute of limitations on conspiracy to defraud when the conspiracy is still active. Walsh's confidence faltered. Still active? The original transactions occurred in the 1980s. The original theft occurred in the 1980s, Brennan corrected. But Morrison Development Group has been actively concealing that theft and profiting from stolen assets for 40 years. Under Ohio Revised Code Section 2913.02, that constitutes ongoing criminal activity. Vincent Morrison Jr. cleared his throat, his voice hoarse with age and stress. Margaret, perhaps we could speak directly, without the lawyers parsing every word. We've known each other since we were children. Surely we can find a reasonable solution. Margaret's expression didn't soften. We have known each other since childhood, Vincent. That's what made your father's betrayal so devastating. Charles Rothschild trusted Vincent Morrison Sr. like a brother. He welcomed him into our family's business, our social circle, our home. And your father repaid that trust by systematically destroying everything we had built over 3 generations. Morrison Jr. looked down at his hands, unable to meet Margaret's gaze. My father told me he had purchased those assets legitimately during the company's financial difficulties. He said the Rothschild family had agreed to the sales. Your father lied to you, Margaret said bluntly, just as he lied to the courts, to the creditors, and to every business partner who trusted him. But you, Vincent, you had 40 years to discover the truth. 40 years to investigate how your family suddenly acquired millions of dollars in assets for pennies on the dollar. Jessica watched the exchange with growing understanding. This wasn't just about recovering stolen property. This was about forcing acknowledgement of a betrayal that had destroyed lives and fractured families. Vincent Morrison III interjected desperately. Even if some of the historical transactions were questionable, Morrison Development Group has added substantial value to those properties over the decades. We've developed them, improved them, created jobs, and contributed to Cleveland's economic growth. That has to count for something. Margaret's laugh was bitter. You've created value using stolen capital, Vincent. Every development project, every renovation, every business success your family has achieved was built on the foundation of assets stolen from the Rothschild family. You're asking me to reward you for being successful thieves. One of Margaret's additional attorneys, a man Bradley now realized was probably a criminal prosecutor, opened a thick folder and withdrew photographs. These are pictures of Eleanor Rothschild's final years in the Shaker Heights psychiatric facility. She spent her last decade believing she was destitute, dependent on state charity for her medical care. He slid the photographs across the table. While she was dying in a state institution, the Morrison family was living in the mansion that should have funded her private health care. Her jewelry collection was being worn by Morrison wives to charity galas that Eleanor Rothschild should have been hosting. Vincent Morrison Jr. stared at the photographs with visible anguish. I didn't know. I swear to you, Margaret, I didn't know your mother was still alive or that she was suffering. My father told me the entire Rothschild family had died in the aftermath of the scandal. Another lie, Margaret said, but you could have investigated. You could have asked questions. You could have wondered why your father suddenly owned a mansion, commercial properties, and investment accounts worth millions of dollars that he had somehow acquired during someone else's family tragedy. Bradley realized he was witnessing something beyond a legal confrontation. This was a moral reckoning that had been building for 4 decades, and his mother was systematically dismantling not just the Morrison family's financial empire, but their ability to maintain the fiction that they were innocent beneficiaries of their grandfather's crimes. Patricia Walsh made one final attempt to salvage the situation. Ms. Rothschild, assuming for the sake of argument that your claims have merit, what would you consider a fair resolution? Monetary compensation? A percentage of current property values? Some form of partnership arrangement? Margaret stood and walked to the conference room windows, looking out at the Cleveland skyline where buildings developed with stolen Rothschild money dominated the downtown core. I want every asset stolen from my family returned to Phoenix Holdings, she said, without turning around. I want a full public accounting of Vincent Morrison Sr.'s crimes published in the Cleveland Plain Dealer. I want personal apologies from both Vincent Morrison Jr. and 3, acknowledging their family's theft and the damage it caused to mine. She turned to face the room. And I want Vincent Morrison Jr. to explain to his son and grandson exactly how this happened, so they understand that their entire lives have been built on stolen foundations. Vincent Morrison Jr. was quiet for a long moment, staring at the photographs of Eleanor Rothschild's final years. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Vincent, he said to his son, there are things about your grandfather that I never told you. Things I tried to forget, but that I've carried with me for 50 years. Vincent Morrison III looked between his father and Margaret with growing dread. What things? Your grandfather didn't just embezzle money from the Rothschild family, Morrison Jr. said slowly. He orchestrated the entire scandal that destroyed their reputation. He planted evidence of financial impropriety in Charles Rothschild's office. He bribed witnesses to testify against the family in court. He manipulated newspaper reporters to write stories that made the Rothschilds appear guilty of crimes they never committed. The conference room fell silent except for the muffled sounds of traffic from the street below. Vincent Morrison III stared at his father in horror. You knew this? You've known this my entire life, and you let me believe we were legitimate business people? Morrison Jr.'s eyes filled with tears. I was 25 years old when my father died and left me control of the company. By then, we owned dozens of properties, had millions in assets, and employed hundreds of people. I told myself that even if the origins were questionable, we were using the resources responsibly. Margaret returned to her seat, her expression showing the first hint of sympathy she had displayed all day. Vincent, you were young and probably frightened, but you had choices. You could have investigated. You could have made amends. You could have reached out to my family. I was a coward, Morrison Jr. admitted. I was terrified that if the truth came out, everything would collapse. The business, the employees, my own family's security. I convinced myself that the Rothschild family was gone, that no one was being hurt by maintaining the status quo. Vincent Morrison III slumped in his chair, the weight of his family's crimes finally settling on his shoulders. So everything we have, everything I thought we built, it's all stolen. Yes, Margaret said simply, all of it. David Brennan checked his watch. It's 4:15. We have 45 minutes before the legal filings become irrevocable. Patricia Walsh looked defeated. What exactly are you proposing, Ms. Rothschild? Complete liquidation of Morrison Development Group? Bankruptcy? Criminal prosecution? Margaret considered the question carefully. Vincent Jr., you said you've carried this knowledge for 50 years. You've lived with the guilt of knowing your family's success was built on destroying mine. Haven't you wanted to make it right? Morrison Jr. nodded slowly. Every day. But I didn't know how, and I was too afraid to try. And Vincent III, now that you know the truth about your inheritance, what do you want to do? The younger Morrison was quiet for several minutes, staring at the photographs of Eleanor Rothschild's final years. When he spoke, his voice was steady but filled with resolve. I want to make it right. I want to return everything that was stolen from your family, and I want to publicly acknowledge what my grandfather did. But Ms. Rothschild, I have over 300 employees who depend on Morrison Development Group for their livelihoods. Whatever we do, I need to find a way to protect them. Margaret smiled for the first time since entering the conference room. Vincent, those employees have been doing excellent work developing properties that belong to my family. I see no reason why they shouldn't continue doing that work for Phoenix Holdings. The implications of her statements sank in slowly. Vincent Morrison III looked up with cautious hope. You're saying you'd keep the company operational? Keep the employees? I'm saying that Phoenix Holdings has extensive real estate holdings that require professional management and development expertise. Morrison Development Group has demonstrated considerable skill in those areas, even if they were working with stolen assets. David Brennan pulled out a prepared document. We've drafted a proposed settlement that would transfer all stolen assets to Phoenix Holdings while maintaining Morrison Development Group as a subsidiary company focused on property management and development. The Morrison family would become employees rather than owners, but the business operations would continue. Patricia Walsh reviewed the document quickly, her legal training allowing her to identify the key terms rapidly. This would essentially make the Morrison family employees of Phoenix Holdings, working to develop properties they once thought they owned. Poetic justice, Margaret said. Vincent Morrison Sr. made the Rothschild family lose everything through his criminal actions. Now his descendants will rebuild the Rothschild estate through honest work. Vincent Morrison Jr. looked at his son and grandson, seeing 40 years of guilt finally approaching resolution. Vincent, what do you think? Vincent Morrison III studied Margaret's face, seeing something there that surprised him. Not vindictiveness or cruelty, but a kind of stern fairness that offered redemption alongside justice. I think, he said slowly, that it's time for the Morrison family to stop profiting from crimes we should have confessed decades ago. Ms. Rothschild, if you're willing to offer us the chance to make amends through honest work, then yes, we accept your terms. Margaret nodded approvingly. Then let's finalize the paperwork. David, please prepare the settlement documents for signature. As the attorneys began organizing the complex legal transfers that would restore the Rothschild fortune and transform the Morrison family from thieves into employees, Margaret turned to Bradley and Jessica. Now do you understand why I kept the jewelry collection? She asked quietly. Those pieces weren't just memories of my mother. They were reminders of what was stolen from us, and symbols of the justice I was determined to achieve. Bradley looked at his mother with complete admiration. You never forgot who you really were. No, Margaret agreed. I never forgot that I was Margaret Eleanor Rothschild, daughter of Charles and Eleanor, inheritor of a legacy that was stolen but not destroyed. And now, finally, that legacy is restored. At exactly 4:47 p.m., Vincent Morrison Jr. and III signed the documents that returned control of millions of dollars in assets to Phoenix Holdings and acknowledged 40 years of theft and deception. The Morrison empire, built on stolen foundations, was officially dissolved, but the Morrison family was offered the chance to rebuild their reputation through honest service to the family they had wronged. As they prepared to leave Morrison Tower for the final time as its owners, Vincent Morrison III approached Margaret with genuine humility. Ms. Rothschild, I want you to know that we'll work to earn your trust and to honor the memory of your parents. This company will be better under Phoenix Holdings than it ever was under Morrison management. Margaret shook his hand with the dignity of someone who had waited 40 years for justice and finally achieved it. Vincent, I believe that's true. And I think your grandfather, wherever he is, finally understands that crime doesn't pay. Eventually, the bill always comes due. 6 months later, Bradley stood in the marble foyer of the Rothschild mansion on Shaker Heights Boulevard, watching his mother descend the grand staircase with the natural grace of someone who had been born to live in such surroundings. The house had been meticulously restored to its original splendor, and Margaret Eleanor Rothschild had finally come home. The transformation in their lives had been breathtaking. Phoenix Holdings was now openly acknowledged as one of Cleveland's most powerful real estate development companies, with assets worth over $200 million. The Rothschild Family Foundation had expanded its charitable works, announcing a $50 million initiative to build affordable housing throughout Ohio. And Margaret had revealed depths of business acumen and social connections that had left Bradley wondering how many other secrets his mother had kept over the years. The caterers will be here in an hour, Margaret said, adjusting a genuine diamond bracelet that had belonged to her great-grandmother Rose, one of several pieces of authentic Rothschild jewelry that had been recovered from private collectors who had unknowingly purchased stolen goods from Vincent Morrison Sr. decades earlier. Are you nervous about tonight? Tonight was the inaugural gala for the Rothschild Foundation's new headquarters, a restored 19th-century mansion that would serve as both administrative offices and a museum documenting Cleveland's philanthropic history. The guest list included Cleveland's mayor, several state legislators, prominent business leaders, and, at Margaret's insistence, Vincent Morrison Jr. And III, who would be recognized for their cooperation in restoring stolen assets and their commitment to making amends for their family's crimes. I'm not nervous, Bradley said, straightening his bow tie. I'm still adjusting to the idea that my mother is one of the most powerful people in Cleveland. Margaret laughed, a sound that had become more frequent and genuine since her return to the mansion. I was always one of the most powerful people in Cleveland, Bradley. I just chose to use that power quietly, until the right moment. Jessica emerged from the library wearing an elegant navy gown that had been a gift from Margaret. In the 6 months since the confrontation with Morrison Development Group, Jessica had enrolled in business school and had been working part-time as a financial analyst for Phoenix Holdings. Her natural talent for numbers and research had proven invaluable in managing the newly expanded Rothschild empire. The final guest count is 312, Jessica reported, consulting her tablet. The Cleveland Plain Dealer wants to do a feature story about the foundation's expansion, and Channel 5 is sending a camera crew to cover the gala. Margaret nodded approvingly. Good. Transparency has always been important to the Rothschild family. We want people to see exactly how we're using the recovered assets. The doorbell chimed with the melodious tone that Bradley remembered from childhood visits to wealthy friends' homes. Now he understood why those sounds had always seemed familiar. They were the echoes of his own family's heritage. Margaret opened the door to reveal David Brennan, accompanied by a woman Bradley didn't recognize. She was in her 70s, with silver hair styled in an elegant chignon, and eyes that seemed remarkably familiar. "Margaret," the woman said, her voice trembling with emotion. "My God, you look exactly like Mother did at your age." Bradley felt his breath catch as he realized who this had to be. Margaret stepped forward, tears streaming down her face, and embraced the woman who could only be her sister Catherine. "Kathy," Margaret whispered. "I thought I'd never see you again." Catherine Rothschild, now Catherine Hamilton, as Bradley learned, had been living in Santa Barbara, California for 40 years under her married name. She had built a successful career as an art dealer and had raised 3 children who knew nothing about their Rothschild heritage. When news of Morrison Development Group's collapse and Phoenix Holdings' emergence had reached the California newspapers, Catherine had finally understood that her sister had achieved what she had thought was impossible: justice for their family. "I saw the articles about the foundation," Catherine said, her voice still shaky with emotion. "I saw your picture in the Los Angeles Times, and I knew immediately that little Margaret Eleanor had somehow managed to restore everything Father lost." Margaret led Catherine into the mansion's restored drawing room, where family portraits that had been sold and scattered decades earlier now hung in their original positions. Catherine stopped in front of a large oil painting of their parents, Charles and Eleanor Rothschild, painted in 1978, just 3 years before the scandal that had destroyed their world. "I was so angry when I left Cleveland," Catherine said quietly. "Angry at Father for trusting Morrison, angry at Mother for her breakdown, angry at you for staying and trying to fight when I thought the cause was hopeless. I convinced myself that the Rothschild name was permanently tainted, that our only choice was to disappear and start over." Margaret joined her sister in front of their parents' portrait. "I was angry too, Kathy, but I was more determined than angry. I couldn't let Vincent Morrison Sr.'s crimes be the final chapter of our family story." Bradley watched the reunion with deep emotion, understanding that he was witnessing the healing of a wound that had festered for 4 decades. His mother had not only recovered the family fortune, she had recovered her sister. "Bradley," Margaret said, calling him over, "I'd like you to meet your Aunt Catherine. Kathy, this is my son Bradley, and that's his wife Jessica. They're the ones who helped me take down the Morrison Empire." Catherine studied Bradley's face with obvious delight. "You have Father's eyes and Mother's stubborn chin. I can see you come from a long line of people who don't give up easily." "Apparently it runs in the family," Bradley said, glancing at his mother with newfound respect. The doorbell began chiming regularly as guests arrived for the gala. Bradley found himself serving as an unofficial host, greeting Cleveland's elite, and introducing them to the woman who had quietly orchestrated one of the most dramatic reversals of fortune in the city's history. Among the early arrivals was Marcus Chen, the jewelry appraiser whose assessment of the fake collection had set everything in motion. He approached Margaret with obvious embarrassment. "Ms. Rothschild," he said formally, "I owe you an apology. When I appraised your reproduction jewelry collection, I had no idea I was looking at memorial pieces that represented your connection to your family's legacy. I'm afraid I focused entirely on monetary value and missed the true significance of what you were showing me." Margaret smiled graciously. Marcus, you did exactly what I needed you to do. Your professional assessment helped my son and daughter-in-law understand that value isn't always measured in dollars and cents. Still, Marcus continued, I've brought something I hope you'll accept as an apology. He handed Margaret a small velvet box. This is an authentic 1920s Rothschild family piece that surfaced at an estate auction in New York last month. The seller had no idea of its provenance, but I recognized the distinctive setting from historical photographs. Margaret opened the box to reveal an exquisite Art Deco ring featuring a large emerald surrounded by diamonds. Her breath caught as she recognized it immediately. This was my grandmother Rose's engagement ring, she whispered. I thought it was lost forever. Consider it a homecoming gift, Marcus said. It belongs with the family. As the evening progressed, Bradley found himself in conversations that revealed the true scope of his mother's influence in Cleveland. The mayor spoke about Margaret's quiet support for urban development projects. The hospital administrator discussed the Rothschild Foundation's medical research funding. The university president thanked her for scholarship programs that had educated hundreds of students over the past 20 years. Your mother has been one of Cleveland's most important philanthropists for decades, the mayor told Bradley. We just didn't know she was doing it with her own family's recovered money. Near the end of the evening, Vincent Morrison III approached Bradley nervously. Over the past 6 months, Vincent had been working diligently as Phoenix Holdings' Director of Development, earning Margaret's respect through his competence and genuine remorse for his family's crimes. Bradley, Vincent said quietly, I wanted you to know that working for your mother has been the most rewarding experience of my career. She's taught me what it means to use business success for genuine social good. Bradley nodded approvingly. She has that effect on people. How are you adjusting to the transition? Better than I expected, Vincent admitted. Honestly, it's a relief to finally be working honestly. I spent my entire life feeling like something was wrong with our success, like it was all too easy and too good to be true. Now I know why, because it was built on a foundation of theft and lies. Vincent paused, then continued with obvious sincerity. Your mother could have destroyed my family completely. She had every legal and moral right to do so. Instead, she gave us the chance to make amends and rebuild our reputation through honest work. That's not justice. That's mercy. As the gala wound down and guests began departing, Bradley found his mother on the mansion's terrace, looking out over the gardens that had been restored to their original formal design. The sapphire necklace from her reproduction collection still graced her throat, but now it was accompanied by authentic family pieces that had been recovered through David Brennan's investigation. Regrets? Bradley asked, joining her at the stone balustrade. Margaret considered the question seriously. About demanding 40 years for justice? No. About living modestly while I built the legal case? No. About keeping family secrets from you? Perhaps a few. Bradley thought about the journey that had brought them to this point, from his desperate demand for what he thought was valuable jewelry to standing in the restored mansion that was his true inheritance. Mom, can I ask you something that's been bothering me? When I first demanded the jewelry, when you gave me that box full of reproductions, did you know what would happen? Did you plan for me to discover they were fake? Margaret's smile was enigmatic. Bradley, I've been planning for 40 years. Did I know that your greed and desperation would lead you to have the pieces appraised? Did I anticipate that the appraisal would shock you into demanding answers about your family history? Did I foresee that learning the truth would help you understand the difference between real value and monetary worth? She paused, her expression growing more serious. Let's just say that I know my son very well, and I've always believed that sometimes people need to see what they think they want before they can appreciate what they actually have. Quote, Jessica joined them on the terrace, carrying a bottle of champagne and 3 glasses. I thought we should toast, she said. To family secrets finally revealed, to justice finally achieved, and to the most incredible woman I've ever known. As they raised their glasses under the stars above the restored Rothschild mansion, Bradley reflected on how completely his understanding of his mother, his family, and himself had been transformed. 6 months earlier, he had been a struggling construction worker married to a woman with expensive dreams, desperately seeking a quick financial fix to their problems. Now he was the son and heir of one of Cleveland's most prominent families, married to a brilliant business analyst, and part of a philanthropic empire that was improving lives throughout Ohio. But more importantly, he had learned that his mother was not the modest widow he had believed her to be, but a strategic mastermind who had spent 40 years orchestrating one of the most complex and successful campaigns for justice in Cleveland's history. "Mom," Bradley said as they sipped their champagne, "there's one more thing I need to know. The jewelry collection, the reproductions that started all of this, what happens to them now?" Margaret's expression grew tender. "They're going to the Foundation's museum, Bradley, along with the authentic pieces we've recovered, and the story of how they came to represent the connection between past and present, between loss and recovery, between the family we lost and the family we found again." She looked at Catherine, who was inside saying goodbye to David Brennan and making plans to extend her visit to Cleveland. "Those reproduction pieces served their purpose," Margaret continued. "They kept my mother's memory alive during her final years. They preserved my connection to our family history during the decades when I had to hide who I really was, and they ultimately led to the restoration of everything Vincent Morrison Sr. tried to steal from us." Jessica raised her glass again. "To Margaret Eleanor Rothschild, who proved that patience, intelligence, and determination are more valuable than any jewelry collection, real or fake." "To justice served cold," Bradley added. "To family," Margaret concluded, "both lost and found." Quote, as they stood together on the terrace of the restored mansion, surrounded by the evidence of a 40-year campaign for justice that had finally succeeded, Bradley understood that he had witnessed something extraordinary. His mother had not just recovered stolen assets or rebuilt a family fortune. She had restored a legacy, honored her parents' memory, and transformed a story of victimization into a tale of ultimate triumph. The fake jewelry that had started it all would indeed find its place in the museum, but its real value had never been in gems or gold. Its value lay in what it represented: the unbreakable connection between a daughter and her family's honor, the determination to right historical wrongs, and the patience to wait decades for the perfect moment to achieve justice. And sometimes, Bradley reflected as he looked at his mother's serene expression in the moonlight, the most valuable inheritance isn't money or property or even genuine jewelry. Sometimes the most valuable inheritance is the knowledge that you come from people who never give up, never forget, and never allow injustice to have the final word. The Rothschild name had been restored not just to Cleveland's social register but to its rightful place in the family's hearts. And that, Bradley realized, was worth more than all the jewelry in the world, real or fake. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.